So I think we can start, and I'll invite George to do our opening remarks. George, Vice President of CEBRI, please, George.
Thank you, Rafaela. Thank you very much, and welcome you all and thank you for taking the time to participate in this, which is the continuation of our energy transition program. So I'd like, on behalf of CEBRI, our chairman, Pio Borges, also on behalf of our partners in this project, the Inter-American Development Bank, and EPE, the state company that is in charge of energy planning. I'd like to first welcome our guests and give very special thanks to Mestil, Dorsdorfer and Roberto Boca for accepting our invitation to be here with us today to share their views on this fascinating theme, which is the energy transition that we are all in the globe involved in. So this, as Rafael will explain to you, this is the third event of our program. We have two before. She'll give you the context, the main takeaways from these previous events. But if I could take just one takeaway from these two events so far, I think I would say that the current energy transition represents an extraordinary opportunity for Brazil. This is due to our fantastic energy and environmental assets, and perhaps probably our most difficult challenge will be to prioritize between so many opportunities that the energy transition brings to Brazil. But of course, energy transition means different things for different countries, and they all have their own contexts, their own circumstances. That's the focus of this program that you have here in CEBRI, the energy transition, what it means for Brazil for the future. But of course, we all know that this is a global effort. We are all together on this under different circumstances. But so it's very important as a result to have the global perspective. And that's the focus today. So it's really a privilege to have the International Energy Agency and the World Economic Forum perspectives on the energy transition. And for us that we are involved in the Brazilian aspect, to see how Brazil can insert itself in this global effort. So again, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Rafaela is conducting brilliantly this program. She's our senior fellow at CEBRI, and I'll pass to her to conduct the work. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, George, for your kind words and opening remarks. Thank you, Mathilde and Roberto, for being here today with us. And a special thank you for our audience, which has been following our program since the beginning. I will try to briefly set the stage, because really today what we most want is to listen and understand and learn from Roberto and Mathilde. So setting this scene and connecting some dots. First, the two last events we had, one COP26 Net Zero Summit, and we had the US Climate Summit, the last two dialogues, and also our two last dialogues. One pretty much focused on the geopolitical scene, and then how could the Brazilian industry evolve. So first of all, highlighting what I would take away from the two summits. The first thing that is, for me, the most important thing is the urge for action, and that this is the decade to deliver. I was struck by some information I got from IHS that around 132 countries has already done some kind of commitment. But of these 132 countries, only 14 of them really transformed this into targets, into some form of reinforcement, law enforcement or whatever. And they only represent 10% of global emissions. So this is something that we really have to do the pledges and to really compromise with them. My second takeaway is that although, and George mentioned this, although this is a global goal, there is no unique path. Countries around the globe are in different stages of development. their profile, and I would add that the profile are different when we look at the matrices. So we will really, really need collaboration, cooperation, the right incentives put in place will be crucial around this journey. And so this is from the summits, and then we had our two dialogues. One of them, and it was the first one, was around the geopolitical stage and how it's going to be important, and the influence will really be associated with the countries with the ability to guarantee clean energy security, and master technology and raw materials will be essential for this transition. And it's important to say as well that the Brazilian energy matrix brings us enormous opportunities. When we see our opportunities within this transition, we see that 49% of our energy matrix is already renewable. So this brings it to an important potential of growth. The second dialogue we had is centered in Brazil. And from this dialogue, we learned two important things. That how are we, and we questioned ourselves, how are we going to enhance economic growth using the transition as a leverage? So today, when we see our matrix, 49% of it is clean. However, the big part of our emissions, they come from land use. They represent land use, and so deforestation, changes in the land agriculture. So it is challenging for us. 70% of it comes from land use around the world. When we look at what's happening in terms of land use, it's only 24%. And then it's important to say that land use, the bad use of it, does not bring GDP growth. It doesn't lead us to transition. So it's not good for us. So how are we going to deal with it? And then it brings us to today with, and I really expect to learn from Meshud and Roberto, the impact post-COVID pandemic. What are our trajectories, especially when we look on the scenarios going forward, the challenges, the opportunities, and how can we monitor these efforts so that we can guarantee that we are in the correct path. So having done this context, I will now properly introduce Meshud Wosthofer. I hope I have said this correctly, holds a master's degree in economic policy and management from Brussels University, a bachelor degree in applied economics from University of Montpellier, and a bachelor degree in applied economics from Wuppertal University Heidelberg. She joined the International Energy Agency in October 2018 as Director of Sustainability, Technology, and Outlets. Mr. Wosthofer plans and coordinates the agency's work on energy sustainability, encompassing energy technology, policy, and climate change policy. Previously, she held several senior management positions in the European Commission, where she coordinated the work on the 2030 Energy Climate Framework and the Clean Energy Package. Roberto Boca leads the energy, mining, and metals, chemicals, and infrastructure teams at the World Economic Forum. In this role, Roberto leads a dynamic team that focuses on critical issues the industry are facing at national, regional, and global level. Before joining the forum in 2009, Roberto was at BP for 14 years, lastly as Director, Emerging Consumer Markets in BP Alternative Energies. So now I will pass to Meshud, so she will lead us to her opening remarks and her presentation. Thank you, Meshud.
Thank you very much, Rafaela, and thank you, George, and welcome to everybody. Many greetings from Paris. It's afternoon, late afternoon already, so good morning or late good morning to Brazil. I'm very pleased to be part of that seminar, and I would like, on behalf of the IEA, thank the organizers, CEBRI and the others, for organizing this important event. And I will speak, as you said, mainly about the COVID impact, the need for clean energy transitions in this particularly important year for energy and climate policy. I think, as you mentioned, I will come back to it, we already had our IEA COP 26th summit, but we had also, importantly, the US climate summit last week, and there's much more happening this year. So the focus on energy and climate policy is absolutely crucial, and I'm delighted to be part of that seminar today. So I have a few slides. I will share my screen. So I hope you can see it. So what was the impact? Let me go next. Okay. So what was the impact of this COVID-19 pandemic? It was a very difficult year from a health aspect, from an economic aspect, from a social aspect, but in a way also from an energy aspect. We have seen that it was a real shock to the energy system. We saw a drop in energy demand of 4%, but this is unevenly across fuels and technologies. We saw a drop in CO2 emissions globally by nearly 6%. And important, we saw a drop in investments by nearly 18%. So even though we got used to that, we need to put in mind that this was the biggest shock in the energy sector since World War II, so since 70 years. So the big question now is what happens next? And we have seen there are, in our analysis, some uncertainties, and the two most significant one is obviously the duration and severity of the pandemic, and also the response from our policymakers. So we have been looking on both of these issues. On the pandemic, we see that in some parts of the world, the economic situation has already been improved. In others, including where I right now live in Paris and Europe, the situation is still quite serious, and in other parts as well. And we have captured that in a scenario in our World Energy Outlook, which is called the delayed recovery scenario, where we looked at the implication of these delays in the recovery. And then secondly, we have been looking at the policy response. As you said also in the beginning, there is also not also only a challenge, but there's also an opportunity out of that crisis to build a cleaner, more secure energy system after the crisis. And we have been looking at what does that mean in terms of sustainable recoveries in cooperation with the International Monetary Fund. So let me just look at the CO2 emissions. You see here a graph of the last 30 years and the global CO2 emission impact. And we have been seeing in the last 30 years, basically an increase every year of CO2 emissions, except the year of the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and as I just mentioned, in 2020. But if we look, and that we released a week ago, the estimates for 2021 based on the first 3 months of 2021. And the projection indicate that coming out of the COVID crisis and the economies to recover, we see an expected increase, rebound of energy demand by 4.6%, and pushing the global energy use in 2021 nearly at the level of the pre-COVID-19. So there are major uncertainty that depends on the rollout of vaccines, economy, effectiveness of the stimulus packages. But this is a clear message that we need to be very, very careful. If our estimates for 2021 are the right ones, it would mean a second biggest historic rebound in 2021, which we have only seen so far in 2010. And that was one of the strong messages Dr. Fatih Birol gave also at the US Climate Summit last week. We need to be very careful and very much aware if governments, companies, and stakeholders, if we don't act together, there will be a dramatic rebound of the global CO2 emissions. This situation is obviously different in where you are. We have been looking at what has happening on the CO2 emissions in some of the major emitters. We all know that the major emitters, the roughly 28% of the global CO2 emissions come from China, roughly 15% from the US. The EU together has 8% share of the global CO2 emissions. India has a roughly same share of 8%, but the per head emission is obviously very much different if you speak about India or other emerging economies or the US or the Europe. But you can see here that the world is coming back on the CO2 emissions already in December this year. And as I said before, we expect a rebound of 4.9% for 2021. China, who has come out more early out of the economic crisis, is already at a higher level of CO2 emissions in December than when you look at the start of last year. India has a particular difficult situation, as we all know, including with the pandemic. So they are a slight rebound, but there is a lot of uncertainties, and the US is at a lower level. We have been looking also at Brazil. Brazil is, I would say, roughly at the same level as before the crisis. So not like China and not like US, but somewhere in between. But it's also different, not only if we look at the regions, but at what fuels, what technologies. And I will highlight just 3 areas of the energy sector here: oil and gas, electricity, and energy efficiency. So let me start where we are on the oil and gas sector and the oil and gas producers. We saw before COVID that there was already a difficult situation when it comes to oil and gas sector, given that we have looked at clean energy transition, we have seen net zero announcement, and the oil and gas sector has been under pressure already before COVID. That's true for Middle East, that's true for Latin America, that's true for many other parts. But when we look at the post-COVID and the updated policy settings, we see, and we looked at the money and the value of the global oil and gas productions up to 2040, we saw a decrease of roughly 24% due to the crisis, and mainly due to the stop in the economic situation in the transport sector, which impacts obviously oil, but also in the economic sector as a whole. And gas and oil are the 2 energy resources which have been mainly affected. And that has obviously a huge impact on the countries which are heavily dependent on oil and gas revenues. And if we look on where we need to go, which is our sustainable development scenario, which is Paris aligned, this would be even more. It's needed to go to the Paris aligned scenario, which a further decrease for gas and oil sector by 34%. So we see a lot of evidence on the pressure on company strategy, but also obviously this applies to major producing economies. And that underlines something we had been saying even pre-COVID, as I said, that there is the importance of efforts to diversify and reform the economy, certainly for those who are heavily dependent on oil and gas. Let me look at another sector, which is hugely important. That's the global electricity generation. And we have been looking by electricity generation by technologies. The COVID meant last year that investments in oil and gas have been falling sharply. Investments in other sectors, and in particularly in renewables, are much more resilient. And the good news, as was mentioned, Brazil is a country which has nearly half of the generation coming from renewables, hydro and others. So this has been more resilient than, for example, the oil and gas sector. But we need also to look what it means when we look ahead for the clean energy transitions. And yeah, and if we look where it's going in the next, I hope to show that, when we're going by 2025, you see a deep shift from the lead of gas and coal to renewables. So this has started. As I said, COVID year was difficult but resilient for renewables. But the more we look ahead, and if we only look ahead in the next couple of years, we see a major shift that renewables worldwide will become the largest source of electricity generation, overtaking coal. And this is important if you look at Asia. Asia is the country where coal and the average age of coal-fired plants is still 12 years. In the rest of the world, in most of the advanced countries, coal phase out is happening over the next couple of years. But the eye here is also on Asia and other parts. But the good news is globally that hydropower is still the largest source of renewable power, but the growth is elsewhere, and that is wind, onshore and offshore, and also solar PV. And as the world relies increasingly on electricity, that means solar and wind and renewables becoming more important. But this is also a reminder that we also need investment in grids and other sources of flexibilities to accommodate the rise of some more flexible wind and solar in the future. And that is where the split is in renewables, as you see, as we move forward. A third area where I would like to put an emphasis on is energy efficiency. We all know that in order to have the clean energy transition, and in particular net zero by 2050 or around 2050, we need to progress on energy efficiency. But unfortunately, if we look at the global energy intensity improvements, we saw a dip in 2017, 2018. We saw a slight improvement in 2019, but unfortunately, in the crisis year in 2020, that has added an extra level of stress, and energy intensity only improved by 0.8% in 2020. It's roughly half the rates if we look at the corrected by weather and other parameters, which has been 2019 and 2018. And that is well below what it's needed to be Paris Agreement aligned and achieve our global climate and sustainable goal. That's why here also a message on the recovery. I come back that here in the next slide, where we need to go. So in our World Energy Outlook, we had been looking on what's it's needed in the different scenario, which are the stated policy. That means we have updated that WEO 2019 and WEO 2020, where if we don't do anything and just continue, we won't get to any improvements in coming to CO2 emissions in the next couple of years. We had, as I said, looked, as there is a lot of uncertainty, how the world will recover, when it will recover, and what that means in terms of the CO2 emissions and what is needed in clean energy transition. When we look at that delayed recovery, there is a lot of delays when it comes to efficiency, renewables, and others. And that is something which would have a huge social and economic cost also when it comes to delayed emission reduction. When we look at our sustainable development scenario, which is Paris aligned, and where we look at to becoming closer to the net zero by 2050, there we see that, sorry, I come back to that. There we need to do much, much more in terms of efficiency, in terms of renewables and technology and innovation. And I can only already announce that in roughly 3 weeks, the IEA will come out with a global net zero roadmap by 2050, where we look at all the pledges done right now, including what happened last week at the US Climate Summit. We look at what needs to be done in the different sectors, so not only power, but also industry, transport, and buildings, and what does it mean by the different regions. So we will update these trends, which I just showed. Let me just underline that we are very pleased to work with Brazil. Brazil had become an association country many years ago for the IEA, and we had intensified our work with Brazil, with CEBRI, with EPE, with the ministry on different topics. We had been looking at gas and power market reform, at energy efficiency, on R&D data. We work with Brazil on the BioFuture platform. We start a dialogue on hydrogen and other technologies. We are part of Mission Innovation, where Brazil plays a major role. So we are very happy that this continued relationship is bringing fruit, and that makes me very happy also to be part of the event today. And I close my presentation now, and we will have time for a few questions afterwards. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Marsha. And it's definitely going to be important, all this coordination and working together with the agency and the World Economic Forum to make this happen. So with that, I'll call Roberto. Will also share some slides with us.
Yes, buen dia. And so let me start. And so I see already there are some questions coming up. And so it would be great. So I'll go quickly through my slides so that we can have a bit of time for the conversation that I'm sure is interesting. So at the forum, we have been measuring this energy transition now for 10 years. So just last week, we issued our 10th year report on the energy transition. What do we measure in this? We measure the performance, so how a country is doing in terms of energy transition, so the performance today, the triangle that you see there, and then we measure the enablers. So as a country put in place the measure, and Matthew referred to some of them, the policies and the roadmap, etc., the targets to achieve those, the energy transition that is needed. So I like to emphasize one thing, that for us, energy transition is not only about climate, although climate is a very important part in this triangle that you see on the left. But energy transition is to move all the energy system to be providing energy access to everyone in a secure way, in a way that is enabling an economic development and economic growth. So affordability is a critical element, and of course, then the sustainability part. But I just want to emphasize this, that for us, when we measure, we are not just measuring emission, but all of these complex set of elements. Now, when we look at the last 10 years, as I was saying, this is the index reflecting the last 10 years. And in the last 10 years, the index has improved 8 out of the 10 years. In itself, looks like a good news, but of course is not, because the speed and the scale is still not there. So when we look at the 2 dimensions before, right, if you think of the system performance, there have been very important improvement in terms of energy access and energy security. Some of the numbers are saying that the people without any access to modern form of energy went down from 1.2, 1.3 billion to roughly 800 million. So that's an important improvement. And also in terms of environmental sustainability over the 10 years period, you know, the element of energy intensity has improved significantly. Although, as we have seen from Mitchell, some of those didn't improve in the last year or so. So the curve is flattening instead of steepening, right? Then when we look at the element of the 3rd element of the triangle, the enabling economic growth and development, this over the 10 years has been quite flat, because some of the elements have been an increasing cost of energy, and so this is creating unaffordability. And I'll come back to the issue of the just transition. That is a big issue when we move again beyond the climate piece that you hear already quite a lot from everyone. So in terms of the enabling factor, the other side of what we are measuring, the enablers, there has been good progress. There has been a strengthening of the enabling environment. We look at 8 out of the 10 largest economy have set net zero emission goal by 2050. So there is the right, if you like, goal, but of course then there is the issue with the milestone, clear maps, and achieving those targets. So in the last 10 years overall, 80% of the country have improved their aggregate score, but only 13 countries have really improved year on year. So this is a bit of nice story and also not so nice story. When we look at the regions, we have seen progress over all the regions, as you see on this chart. A couple of considerations. One is that the top 10 countries are relatively small. If you look at the index, there are only 2 countries that are in the G20, and the others are relatively small, including the country where I'm resident now, that is Switzerland. The other thing that there is to notice is the top 10 countries, so the countries that were at the top, have increased only marginally. You see the 1.1% increase. It means that once there is already an improvement, the low-hanging fruit are gone, and there is a challenge to get to the next level. And as we know, the next level is very far away to achieve the last chart from Majid, I think, was indicating that how much farther down has to go that curve when it comes in particular to climate. So there is really struggling to improve beyond. And that's big part of what we have been looking at is this element of resilience. So how we make sure that we evolve the energy system at scale, at speed, and in a way that is resilient, right? So what are those ingredients that can make that we don't go back, right? Because there are more and more crises. There has been the financial crisis, there has been COVID, and there will be other crises. Hopefully not as dramatic as this one, but there will be other crises. So how we make the transition resilience, and what are the elements that are critical? So here are the 3 key elements that I like to illustrate. One is the element of society and policy. The transition has to be just and inclusive. We can't think of a transition that is, I remember speaking with the minister once, he was saying, no one left behind. It's great to close the coal plant. I think there was a question in the Q&A, but first of all, who pays? And what about those people, the miners, those people that are working in the power plant, etc. So all of that needs to be taken into account. So there is a big issue of a just transition and inclusive transition, and clearly having clear policies is a critical element to have in place. Binding legislation element that are really clear going forward. So that's the element 1, society and policy. Second element is the element of the energy system. So we have to look at the energy system not as in isolation, but really holistically. Very often, again, when we talk about transition, we talk about climate and we talk about the oil and gas sector and a fight against the oil and gas or the coal sector. But actually, there is the supply side, but there is also the demand side. So and when we look at the demand side, where are the big demand centers? Cities and industrial activities. How we address those? Because eventually some of the supplier will tell you until there is the demand, we serve the demand. So if we look only at the supply side is a problem. So we have to look at the supply and the demand and then together. So that's the second element. And the third one that speak again to the question that was there is about the financing. So yes, of course, it makes sense logically saying, let's close the power plant that are coal burning and so on. Okay, but who is going to pay? Those plants are mainly in developing economies, and there is again this issue of just society in a way in which the Western world or some countries have developed polluting, and then now the other cannot develop anymore because they have to pay for that. So there is a question of how we make sure that there is available finance to address this transition in a speedy way, at scale and resilient. So these are the 3 elements that I wanted to bring to your attention. And then I briefly come to Brazil. I think you might be interested in looking. So Brazil is 30th, so number 30 out of 115 countries that we measure. That is very good, is the first part of the table in our chart. Is also, if you look at the last 10 years, it's mainly been stable. If you see from this chart, of course, when in terms of climate, you start from a high renewable mix with the hydro and the biofuels, etc., and good situation in terms of energy access, etc. But in the last 10 years, the improvement has been relatively modest, right? So how we push it harder in terms of getting to those numbers that are needed for a global transition. So a good starting point, but a lot to do, if I can summarize that very briefly. And then when it comes to the this is the situation of Brazil, where you see the line versus the global average. Again, as I was saying, Brazil is 30 in the ranking, is doing relatively well. There are some areas where it's doing particularly well, and some area in which, of course, there can be learning from other countries and other regions. And this is some of the points that were raised earlier, both from George and Rafaela, in terms of every transition is country centered, but of course there is a global element to it. So I leave you with the last slide. That is a picture that we took about a year ago in a debate where, just a few months in the COVID, saying what will be the impact. And it's actually quite interesting looking at this, image of what were the issue and the concern there, etc. Because we all had in mind then, as we have now, how quickly we can get back on track for this energy transition, and what are we really trying to do, how ambitious we want to be. And I think I stop here, Rafaela, to give us the chance to have a bit of interaction.
Thank you so much, and it was very interesting. And coming to Brazil, good thing to say is that I totally agree that there's a lot to be done, especially because the bad use of land, where there's a lot of improvement in Brazil, does not bring well-being and does not bring GDP. So it totally does not make sense for our future. So thank you, Roberto. So the first question I will address to Mathilde, and it also resonates with what both of you brought, that there's a lot to be done. There's massive efforts required. And when we look at that, how far are the announcements from actions really needed? So if you could explore a little bit, Mathilde, the actions really needed, I would pass it to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafaela, and thank you for your question. And I think also congratulations to Roberto. I think it fixed well to see it in a broader context, what is needed, not only in Brazil, but overall. I think to start with some good news is that we see more and more countries, companies, and so on stepping up. You quoted a few figures I have here, that there are at least 44 countries, probably after the US Climate Summit. There are even more. Brazil, the president announced to go net zero to 2050 instead of 2060. There are US, Japan, Korea, and others who have already either announced it or are speeding it up. So these are globally good news. We think that these pledges account for roughly 70% of global CO2 emissions and 70% of global GDP. But as you say, the situation in each country is different. And one thing is to make the pledge, and the other thing is to implement them. So at the IEA, we look at three things in a way. We look at the concrete policies. I mean, we are an energy organization. We know 75–80% of the CO2 emissions come from energy. So we look at the concrete policies now in the next 3 years, to 2030 and to 2050. So we have these three kind of timelines. We are analyzing what, for example, the sustainable recovery plans include in terms of clean energy technologies. The EU has stepped up a major program where they say at least 1/3 of the recovery stimulus packages should go in green technologies or in green investments. We are monitoring that. We do it also for other regions. So we look at the implementation of concrete policies to the targets. Secondly, we monitor and track what those policies concretely deliver. So once is to look at the policies and then track it. And I think there's also a lot happening at the national level, so we can exchange best practice. But I think there are some pledges which are quite far from what really is needed. And thirdly, as it was also mentioned by Roberto, it's not only about the CO2 emissions, it's about jobs. And that, frankly, came out very strongly at the US Climate Summit. The US has said so, but it's not only the US. It's also Brazil, it's also Europe, it's Asia. We need to link it with jobs, otherwise it doesn't work. And that's why we had in our Sustainable Recovery Plan last year, first time looked how many people are working in the energy sector, what does it mean to go in the clean energy transitions, and we see a lot of opportunities for new jobs. In the energy efficiency sector, for example, in the renovation, it needs money, so finance is a very important element here, but it needs to be linked to the economy, to jobs, and the security of the energy system. So that's where we are looking at, and that's why I say one thing we come out on the 18th of May is exactly that. We look at the details of each pledges and we plan to track it, and we are happy to work with the different regions. But that good news from the beginning needs to be followed up, because I think we are not yet there, but I think we can make it. Let's put it like that.
Perfect. And I totally agree. We have to bring all these solutions together and tackling jobs and how these innovations are going to come along, and technologies. Everything is important to be thought of. And then I'll push it to Roberto exactly at this point, because the COVID, it really pushed the world economy from abandoning the business as usual and to rethinking the energy transition. At the same time, we have all these thoughts and we are having all these buzz with summits, COP26 coming along. We see increase in poverty in several countries, greater uncertainty, risk aversion, and all these come along as big challenges. So in the World Economic Forum's perspective, in your perspective, Roberto, which trends shall prevail regarding the possibilities of accelerating and how to blend this all together?
So that's a very important question, right? Because there is the rhetoric, and I really like what Mitchell said, that we are going to measure, right? Because there is a lot of rhetoric out there. Now, our index is done with a lot of data, including IA, of course, but we are also accessing other data. And one data that struck me that was not coming from IA. So if this is not correct, don't blame anybody on this call, including myself. I just quoting it, but is more than 60% of allocation to energy transition relevant sector have been directly or indirectly to support fossil fuel. So even now, so that some of the initial movement, so when you ask me which trends, well, that trend is not a good one. That trend needs to be inverted, that because there are a lot of going back to the job and etc. Sometimes are really important elements that are going to the economy to keep creating job, and especially the indirect. It's very easy that reach those sectors where we not necessarily would like to, but not for climate, but yes, for jobs. So how you manage that trade-off? So that's a big challenge for this. Now, I want to difficult, right? There are so many companies, but we want to do by sector. So a very good trend that is ongoing, and the COP26, we should expect action there, is industrial sector are getting together and trying to tackle the issue, because they realize a company on its own cannot reverse this trend. If you are a chemical industry and you have been optimizing your processes for 50, 60 years, you can now switch in 2-3 years, the decade of delivery, Rafaela, you mentioned, in the next 5-6 years, you can't switch to a electrified catalyzer, whatever, all the processes, etc. you want to do. So it is very important that the sectors start working together, and it's very important the sector start working across. In the example of the chemical, if you want to electrify, you need to work with electricity companies. So you have to work the chemical sector together with the electricity sector to address those issues. So that's the second trend. The third one, or what we should be watching for, if you like, to go in the right direction. The third one is you mentioned it already, is really this element of international collaboration mechanisms. On that, I would put a green or a pale green at the moment for the reason Mitchell said earlier, the meeting last week convened by the US. That's a great opportunity. If people can see climate as they saw COVID is a humanity problem. And there is a competitive element because there is always in the world of today of geopolitics, etc. But there is a humanity issue. So if the different big country in particular can get together and address it, put the money on the table and collaborate, that's a great opportunity. So, be careful to the three trends. One, we have to be careful to, unattended consequences of some of the funds where they are going from this recovery fund. Second is this element of the industry, the sector, and cross-sector collaboration. And the third one is really this element of the collaboration at country level. And of course, then there is the private-public, being the institution for public-private collaboration at the forum. Of course, I will say public-private, but in general, international collaboration is really critical. I stop there.
Thank you so much. And I really, really think that the big thing for us, before asking Matthew, is this change in mindset that you mentioned from COVID, that if we don't collaborate, if we don't think that it's a global matter and it's going to be bad for everybody if we have a disaster, if we go to this vision, this will change everything because there's space for everybody to grow and this gain-gain solution that we could move forward. So thank you. And we do expect World Economic Forum to help us on that. And Matthew, so what I would bring a little bit to everybody's looking to COP26 and everything. There's a lot being said. We know there's a G20 coming along, but then there is this big event, COP26. What achievements could we expect? And what would you really like to see happening at the COP20 thing that would make it a big game changer for the next decade, for this decade, actually?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we should look now 2030. I mean, it's good to have the net zero pledges for 2050, but if we don't start now, we will never get to it. And I mean, I can only say in our analysis of the roadmap 2050 globally, when I look at actions to be until 2030, it's huge. It's enormous what needs to be done in all sectors, in the whole economy, to become decarbonized in the longer run. So I think the COP this year, and there's a clear commitment from the UK and Italy, from the presidencies, and the milestones we had from the IEA, a major event together with COP on the 31st of March, where we had, including the Brazilian minister and other leaders, we heard about the US. And I think that is already a good part, because one of the key asks of the COP is to update the NDCs, the national determined contributions. And it's a voluntary process. It's not an obligation. But the peer pressure we see now, and what happened until last year, what happened now a week ago, and what could happen in terms of new or updated NDC, I think we are on a quite good track. I mean, that's what is then outstanding is what is the core negotiation between the climate negotiator, which is about transparency. I think there is still a lot to do. I mean, not to double claim any of the CO2 emission reductions in two parts of the world or in others. So the transparency issue is we are part of that from the data colleagues. It's a tricky one. Then there is some of the outstanding rules on the implementation and the Article 6, which is about the carbon markets, where there is not yet an agreement. And I think the parties need to get together, and also on the financial goals. They had a huge financial goal, where is not? So there are the implementation, the Article 6, and the finance. And I think the moment is good. What is another thing, what we just heard a week ago in terms of preparation of COP, they normally have in June quite important meetings at the technical level on this issue in person in Bonn. They cannot do it. They just decided to that's virtual again. So I think it's a hard time also for the COP presidency to reach out and for the negotiators to do everything virtually. So that we are used to it now and so on, but I think it's a tough thing if you are getting on the negotiation side. And so we only can hope that COP and as such will happen in person, maybe not as large as we are used to with all the side events and all that, but that the core people can come together in person and so on. So I think there are some positive commitments, new commitments on NDCs, but there's still some work to do on transparency, on carbon markets, and on finance. But as I said, the presidency seems to be, it's a very good team. UK is committed together with Italy, and we are there to help, and I think other partners as well. Thank you.
That's great. That's great. And it will be, I think it will be important. I haven't heard it yet. It's the first time I get this news that probably they will meet personally, even in the small group. We are missing that and all this interaction. For instance, for me, it would be great to be in the same room as you guys. So it would be something good. Now, before I jump into my last questions, we will try to make this interactive with the audience. And we have here 4 questions, a quiz, and I will ask Gabriela, that is here with us, to start the poll. The idea is that we will make a question to the audience. There's the code here is just to put the cell phone, or the log is here as well. And then you just put the cell phone. I'll do the explanation in Portuguese as well. Então é só conectar, fotografar com o celular o link, o code, e já vão aparecer as perguntas. So we'll have the first question, and let's just give 1 minute for the audience so that they are able to get the code and start it. I'll do it myself as well. So I'm already in. I don't know. Gabriela, do you see how many? Yes, I think we can. Oh, there's a lot of questions already coming along. So the first question, I'll translate it to English, is there a trade-off between economic growth and the expansion of environmental social sustainability policies and practices in Brazil? So the time's running up. So most of our respondents, so before going to the second one, on this first one, most of our respondents understand that the economic development could go together with a transition to go greener, to a cleaner environment here in Brazil. The second question we have here is, what type of company is best positioned to leverage investments toward a green infrastructure in Brazil? And then we're seeing public companies. Okay, let's see. Time's running, people are answering. So most of them think that the best positions one in Brazil to leverage investments towards a green infrastructure, a greener infrastructure, would be the public companies. Okay. So 40%, 30 and 28, very next one to the other. And then the third question is talking a little bit of multilateralism. What international alliances should Brazil seek in countries to partner with during this transition to a low carbon future? And respondents say, United States, China, and others. Time to collaborate. Okay. European Union, only China, only the US, but most of the audience thinks that multilateral interactions with China, United States, and others. I would put European Union as well in this others. Then, okay. Then the last question, will the COVID pandemic bring permanent changes to consumer behavior, changing permanently the energy demand profile? So let's see. Yes, no. Okay, heading to the end. Nearly 50-50. So then the last question. We can start. Which elements are more critical to be able to achieve the targets within this century? And then we have policy, financing, technology, and consumer behavior. So policy is in first place. Financing, technology, I would say them all, but definitely policy is really important element. Thank you, Gabriela. Pass here to Roberto and to Matthew. It was interesting to see how the public was reacting, and what we can see is multilateralism as something important, and then definitely interacting with China and with the US and with the European Union, I think are the most important ones that appeared. And then when talking about infrastructure in Brazil, which will be very important, how can we accelerate our industry in a greener way? And when they were asked, national, private companies or public companies, then the public companies were the ones that most appeared for infrastructure in Brazil. Another interesting is when we asked about the consumer behavior and are these changes here to stay, was nearly 50-50, people believing that it is and that we will have a new profile of energy demand, and part of them, 42%, believing that no, we will probably shift back a little bit to what we had before. I would like to hear some comments, if possible, from Roberto and you, Matthew. That would you like?
I'll be brief, right? I'll start and I'll be brief, and then so Mitchell, you can close off on this. But I think there is also comment on the question about China, etc. So I think it's in our end. Will be going back or not depends which policy are put in place and how serious we will be about addressing this issue. China is going to play a critical role in the transition, no doubt. There is a lot of demand coming from there, a lot of consumption, a lot of emission. So they're going to play a critical role. And the good news, looking back at our index, is one of the only 13 countries, is the biggest of the 13 countries that has been improving in our index year on year. Of course, they are still not at the top of the table because they have a lot of coal and a lot of other challenges, but is very, very important. The direction is right, and in the, you know, it's critical to have them at the table. And they are launching a carbon market in a couple of months. That is going to be a critical element also for that, because there are now carbon market a bit across the world that are going to be an important element for addressing this issue. Putting a price on carbon is a simple way economists would tell us to resolve the emission issue. So very, very interesting input and answer from all the questions, but I give it now to Mechthild for her comment.
Thank you, Roberto. And what about you, Mechthild?
Thank you. I agree with Roberto on the crucial importance of China, and we work with them on their carbon markets and the experience. By the way, we also work with EPE in Brazil on a possibility of a carbon market and carbon price. I think it's economically an important tool. But as we saw in the question or in the quiz, the role of governments is absolutely crucial. And in a way that will set the scene also in the behavioral changes. I strongly believe that there will be behavioral changes after the COVID crisis, but it needs a framework. I mean, if we do the same as before and flying and all traveling and so on, there will be not much impact. But if there is a way that there will be more, depending on the country and the circumstances, bike lanes and other examples, what's happening in parts of the world, or speed trains or electricity and so on, there can be an impact. But I think it's interesting to see the question and the answers on all those questions, which are crucial in the way we go forward. But I'm completely convinced, and if the governments don't take that opportunity right now, and the company in the way to invest in clean energy investments, we won't see the improvements, and everything else will follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto and Mechthild. I think this was a great conversation, very interactive. I learned a lot, and I'm really looking forward. And I do believe, as you, Mechthild and Roberto, that together we can do more. And we could definitely transit and do a smooth transition toward a low carbon future. So with that, we will close here today. I will also like to thank the audience. And for those who were not able to be here now, this will be also on YouTube. So we will be able to go back to it. Thank you so much. Have a great day, great evening.
Obrigado.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Obrigado. Bye.
Thank you.